So if you have your Bibles, Esther chapter 5, last week we left with Mordecai goes to Esther, but he can't exactly go to Esther, if we recall, because Esther is the queen, and Mordecai is just the guy who works at the gate. And so what has to happen? One of the eunuchs who works for Esther, he goes back and forth between the two of them, and he has to be wondering what in the world is going on. The queen's wanting me to get messages to the guy at the gate, and what eventually happens is Esther gets a message from Mordecai saying, "Don't you know that maybe you were put in place for such a time as this?" But the part that we pulled out last week is Mordecai saying this: even if you don't do it, God will still make sure what needs to happen happens, because God is faithful to do exactly what he said he would do. And so Esther works up the courage. She says, okay, I'm going to do it. I will go before the king. But remember, if she goes before the king and she's not summoned, anybody who goes before the king and is not summoned, if he doesn't hold out his scepter to them, showing his favor, then that person will die. And so she sends back to Mordecai, Mordecai, here's what I want you to do. I want you and all the people to pray for me as I go to do this. I'm even going to have all my servants that work for me fast and pray. Many of these people did not know Jehovah as their God. They didn't know God Almighty as their God, but they were going to do what Esther asked because she was the queen. That's where we find ourselves this morning in Esther chapter 5. Verse 1, on the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace just across from the king's hall. Now, normally when we think of a queen, queens are always dressed up like the queen. So normally when we read this, when we see that she was wearing royal robes, we sometimes figure she's the queen, she's going to be wearing royal robes. How often? Every day. But what's interesting about this time period in the ancient world is, yes, you had your royal stuff, but then you have your really royal stuff. Think about when we just saw the coronation of the new British monarch. We now have a king again instead of the queen. What do they do for the coronation? Part of the whole ceremony is they go from looking like a king to really looking ridiculously like a king. Forget his new portrait that kind of looked like Satan was coming out of the picture. If you saw it, you know what I mean. But they get the fancy, fancy crown, they get the little orb thing that they hold in their hand, and they have the royal scepter. But even for Camilla, when she dressed up as his wife, she had the same thing. Think about, many of you grew up knowing only as the queen as the monarch of England. She went from being posh and prim, just as the queen, with her little corgis following her around everywhere. But when she went to actually being ceremonially the queen, she had everything. Like all the fancy jewels that are in the Tower of London that they bring out every now and then, they don't use those all the time. It's the same kind of thing for Esther. She didn't just go wearing her every ordinary queenly stuff. She would have put on her ultimate queenly garb, whatever that would have looked like. And so she goes just across from the king's hall, and the king was sitting on his throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her, held out his gold scepter to her. So Esther approached, and he touched the end of the scepter. Now, let's imagine it this way. We're in a big room. King would have had a big room. Imagine if I had one of these chairs where the table was. King is sitting there. He looks to the back through those double doors. He sees Queen Esther right there. Now, at that point, she walks into the doorway. She doesn't approach yet. Why? Because she is not allowed to. No one was allowed to get that close to the king unless he either summoned them or they appeared before him, and he beckoned them. But what was Esther's greatest fear before this moment? that she was going to appear before the king in that way, and instead of him holding out his scepter saying, "Come on in," that he essentially would have said, "Off with her head," if we're going Monty Python type terms. Off with her head. But instead he holds out his scepter. Esther comes forward and she touches it. Then the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you even if it is half the kingdom." Now this is very significant. Why? Because even in the Persian Empire, how much stature did women have compared to men? A lot or little? Little. But she was still the what? She was still the queen, so she still had status. And so him offering her even up to half of his empire meant many different things. First thing, he respected her, he loved her, he trusted her, and that he wanted to do whatever it took to make her happy. Now, at this point in history, have we ever really seen a woman emperor of any vast dominion of land? No. It would have been a rarity, because if you think at how big the Persian Empire truly was, it was the largest empire in the world up to this known point. After the Persians, it would be the Greeks, and after the Greeks, it would be the Romans, and the Romans would have the largest one that ever existed, and it would never be matched again by landmass area. But for him to offer that to her, she went into this situation thinking that she most likely was going to die. But instead, she comes into it, and all of a sudden, the king's like, "Hey, wifey, I love you. You want half the empire?" And you have to be thinking, if you've ever been into a situation to where you're going in not knowing what's about to happen, you think the worst is going to happen, and then all of a sudden something not only good happens, but amazing happens, what happens to your attitude and your mindset? You go, "Oh, okay." And then you go through this thought process of, did I hear that right? Anybody? Just me? And so what does she say? Verse 3. Verse 4. And Esther replied, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet I have prepared for the king." We know one thing at this point. The king liked to go to banquets. Esther chapter 1, Esther chapter 2. Where was the king most of the time in those chapters? At banquets, spending most of his time being drunk off his gourd, but he liked banquets. And so she also invites the king, but she invites Haman. Verse 5, the king turned to his attendants and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. Verse 6, and while they were there drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "Now tell me what you really want." It's almost the situation in everyday life where when someone wines and dines you, the first thought in your head is, what do you really want? Because especially if it's something out of the ordinary and all of a sudden everybody's like, "Oh, they want me to do this, they want me to do, oh, this is great, they think I'm amazing." And then all of a sudden you're like, what do you really want? It's almost like when you're a child and all of a sudden you start doing everything nice for your parents, and then they look at you and say, "What do you want?" I got that. I did that. But the king knew something was up. "What is your request? I will give it to you." And here's this line again. "Even if it is half of the kingdom." Verse 7, Esther replied, "This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what it is really about." You know, one of the things that people often debate is, why didn't Esther ask the very first time what she wanted? And are you ready for this really good theological answer that I'm about to give? I don't know either. Because we don't know. But if I would have to guess, it is because of what happens next. Because as we have seen throughout the book of Esther, God has been orchestrating this entire story exactly the way it needs to happen. So the king comes, Haman comes. You have to think that Haman is living high on it. He's like, I just got asked to a banquet with the queen, by the queen, and I get to do it again tomorrow. Now, at this point, if we remember, Haman is at this point the second highest official in the empire next to the king. All the advisors who gave the king all the bad advice in chapter 1 and chapter 2, the king said, kick you to the curb. We're going to get Haman. He's rich. He's powerful. I want him next to me, and I want him to like me. Because at this point, the governor still had power in their regions in Persia. And so here comes Haman. Because what do we see in verse 9? Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. But, imagine it's a really big but right there. When he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him. Or as we saw 2 chapters earlier, not bowing down before him. Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh his wife and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. Then Haman added, and that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. And she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. Then he added, but this is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there at the palace gate. By worldly standards, would we say that Haman had acquired everything that someone could want at this point in their life? Yes. He had wealth, he had a big family, he had a wife that apparently he liked. He had everything. He was number 2 in the largest empire in the world next to the king. Everything was going his way. But there was one thing that stuck in his craw. Because one of the things that I've learned throughout the years, this is just a general statement, is that for people who want it all, it's never enough. Power's not enough, money's not enough, fame's not enough. They want more and more and more until they have it all. And one of the things that they learn once they have it all is it's not ever enough. Because Mordecai would not bow to him, everything for Haman was ruined. He allowed one person not doing what Haman thought that Mordecai should do to ruin everything. Because what do we see? Starting in verse 10, he bragged to everyone that would listen about how great he was, how good he was, how much he had, all the wealth, all the things. But then Mordecai. Verse 14. So Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends suggested, set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up. So often we hear this phrase that a good wife either makes you or breaks you. A good wife either gives you good advice or bad advice. But sometimes wives tell us what we need to hear to shut us up, gentlemen. I will not say that my wife has ever done that. One, I can't remember. And two, I don't want to get myself in trouble if she did. But what does she say to do? Take care of your problem because you are number two. But who did he still have to ask? The king. Now, growing up, as we hear the story of Esther and Mordecai and Haman and Xerxes, I know growing up as a kid that there were gallows that they would be hanged on. Now, some people would say it goes back to some of the earliest translations into English, it was gallows, but now that we know more historical things about the Persians, is the Persians like to make a spectacle about capital things. I was reading this week, they had many kinds of different ways, and since most of the kids aren't in here, I can tell you most of the things. One of the things that was most common was that they would take burning ash, put somebody in a hole, cover them with burning ash while they were restrained and could not get out. One of the other things, the Persians were some of the first people that started practicing crucifixion. And so, going back, they knew what crucifixion was, they did it. We like to say that the Romans perfected it. But one of the other things that they did was they would impale people on a pole, but not to where it would kill them immediately, but to where it would take 2 days to a week for them to die impaled on a pole. So this was not uncommon for this to happen in the Persian Empire. But if you're going to put somebody in a 75-foot pole, you are trying to make a statement to everyone about everything. If this would have happened, it would have told everyone that the king saw Haman as in charge with as much power and as much authority as he could right next to the king. It's a little bit more graphic than the kids' Bible stories. But why would they want something like this to happen? Because they would not want a rebellion to take place. They would not want people to rise up. Because if Haman did this to a Jew, knowing that this genocidal order was coming down in just a few short months, they did not want the Jewish people to rebel. They essentially wanted the Jewish people to lay down and just take what was coming to them. Because one, that would have made things easier, and two, that would accomplish exactly what Haman wanted to be accomplished. But it's interesting how his wife said this. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. And this pleased Haman. When we talk about people in whether it's books or whether it's in the Bible, and we look at them as the ultimate villains, if you start to think all the different stories that you've seen, the shows, the movies, the cartoons, you can all think of that devilish figure who literally looks and acts like the devil. That is essentially evil incarnate in its purest form. To where someone can kill someone and they walk away and they're happy. It takes someone mentally twisted to want to kill someone and then be happy that they did it. Very first week, we talked about all these different character overviews of the characters that we would find in the book of Esther. And one of the things that I said that very first week is that Haman represents pure evil. When we were in chapter 3, we talked about that Haman came from one of the arch enemies of the Jewish people going back to the time of the judges and into the biblical history that is found in Joshua. Because over and over, the Israelites did not do what they were supposed to do, and now what they didn't do is about to come bite them in the backside. But we see this dichotomy here of two polar opposites. We see Haman, who wants to do nothing but bring death and destruction to the Jewish people. And we see Mordecai and the Jewish people on their knees in prayer. We said a little bit last week, but I want to spend a few moments on this time. Throughout Israel's history, when bad things came, they did not find themselves on their knees praying until the last possible minute. At this point, with 11 months to go, where is Israel already at? On their knees, saying, God, we need you to do something, because that is the only way this could happen. Because if we go back to 2 weeks ago, when the order was given, it was every single Jewish person, man, woman, and child in the entire empire that was to be killed. And every single Persian person living within the empire that was either of Persian nationality or anyone else that lived in the empire had essentially been deputized under this law by Haman to carry out this act with the motivation of whatever you get out of this from the people that you kill, you get to keep. And so every motivation of everything that is wrong with humanity is at play at this point. Greed and power are two of mankind's worst things ever. Why have the majority of wars been fought in human history? Greed and power. Then you have the one random Greek one, which was over a lady. But every other one, greed and power. But with all this in play, Israel finally finds themselves where? Exactly where they needed to be all along. Falling down, mourning, fasting before the presence of God. At the beginning of this chapter, we see Esther actually going and doing. She's finding favor with the king. And so who is at work at this point in this story? God. God is there. He's moving. And the king's just like, okay. We could just think of it as, the king's like, my hot wife wants me? Okay. But instead, if the king would have instead been in a bad mood that day, he could have done to Esther the exact same thing he did with Vashti. And so throughout Esther, we see all these different comparisons of what happened earlier, either in Esther or earlier in Jewish history. But God is about to do something great. We've said week in and week out, we already know how this story ends. And then next week, we're going to see this flip on its head. Because Haman has this poll ready for Mordecai, and then Haman's about to have to honor Mordecai. And what's about to happen? Is Haman's anger going to lessen, or is it only going to grow greater? It's only going to grow greater. You might be thinking, why would God allow this to happen? The easy answer is, I don't know. The informed answer is, God had to get Haman to a certain spot to allow Esther to get to a spot to where the king would get to a certain spot for exactly what needs to happen. Some people who don't believe in the Bible may say, well, that sounds like a bunch of coincidences just happening. To a mathematician, I would say, run the odds and let me know how many scenarios this happens. Because it had to happen very specifically. As what we're going to see next week, it had to happen very specifically that Mordecai would hear about a plot to kill the king. But for all of this to happen, for all my nerdy people, it's like in the last Avengers movie to where Doctor Strange is trying to figure out how many scenarios this could actually possibly happen. And there's only one scenario and it's like billions. And at this one point in the movie, and some of you are like, Matt's nerding out right now. Captain America looks over at Doctor Strange and he just goes, this is it. Now in fantasy, we're like, well, that's pretty cool. In the movie, I was like, this is awesome. But in reality, so many times we're like, God can actually move and do things like that. That God actually wants to do things like that. Not just in Israel's past, but even in our today and tomorrow. Because we try to limit God sometimes and say, well, can he really do that? And the answer is yes. Because all throughout Esther, everything seems stacked against the Jewish people, God's chosen people. But in the end, that they will win out and be victorious because God is their God and he loves them. But it's the exact same thing for you and I, is that he loves us so much. And that he stands in the gap for us just like he did with Esther and Mordecai. You know, one of the things that I said when we started this, when we do things that are more narrative like this, is they build and they build and they build. And we can't wait for the final thing. I mean, we still have 2 weeks till chapter 7 when everything comes against Haman that he plotted for someone else. But God is in this story from the beginning to the end. And I think the beautiful thing about God's word and the way that he works and the way that he does things today is that he wants to work in our lives if we'll let him. You know, I said last week, Mordecai said to Esther, maybe you were put in place for such a time as this, but even if you don't, God will accomplish what he wants to accomplish. If you let him. And it's not necessarily even if you let him, it's if you're willing to actually let him move in your life. One of the worst things that we can be sometimes as Christians who just want to be called Christians and not actually do anything. I got saved, I'm good, I got my fire insurance, but God calls us to something more. He not only calls us to holy living, but he also calls us to go be his hands and feet and tell more people and invite them into what he has for them. To share the goodness that he has given us to them so that they can experience it too. Throughout all of Jewish history, one of the things that he said to Abraham and Isaac and to Jacob and to Moses, it was, you are supposed to be blessed, to be a light to others, to bring people in. Sometimes they did. Most of the time they didn't. Most of the times they were led astray. But at this time, they are actually standing where God wants them to be. And we're about to see the results of his goodness and his mercy to them.